Welcome to Learn, Create, Sew. Today we're going to continue our Christmas gnome tutorials. You can use my basic Christmas gnome tutorial to make a Christmas gnome like this one. Simply add a fur binding to the bottom of the slouchy hat and a little bit of extra fur around the edges, and you'll have a nice dressed up Santa Claus Christmas gnome. We've also in our previous video talked about how to make this little girl Christmas gnome with nice yarn hair, and the videos for both of these two will be linked below. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make their little furry friend. This is the smallest gnome size, it's the tiny size, and you can see he's got a nice antler tied with a red string to the top of his head. And you can choose to use a Pom Pom nose or a wooden bead nose, whichever you prefer. His little tail is my favorite. So let's get started. To make this gnome, you're going to need fabric for the ears. I'm using a dark brown Minky. You're also going to want fabric for the body and tail, and I've got a lighter brown Minky here. You'll want a pipe cleaner for the antler. And you could use a white, a brown, a cream colored. I'm using yellow today. And I have a Pom Pom for the nose. This Pom Pom I actually cut off of some Pom Pom trim, so I'm not exactly sure the size. I think it's somewhere in between 7 and 10 millimeters. You'll also want some red embroidery floss or yarn to tie the antler to the head. You can print out the free pattern for this project from my website, and it's linked in the description below. I'm using Minky for my project today since it has a nice furry look to it, but you could also use other fabrics such as flannel or felt. Since I am using the Minky, I want to make sure that I take note of the nap. That's the direction that the hairs are going. When I brush the Minky this way, it lays nice and smooth. When I go the other way, not so much. So I want to make sure that my pattern pieces are going the correct direction. I want the pile of the Minky to lay smoothly from top to bottom. So I'm going to place the top of my pattern here and the bottom down here so it follows this same direction. So that I don't forget that direction, I'm going to draw myself a little arrow on the back side of my Minky just so I remember which direction it's going, and that will help me when I place my pattern pieces on it later. You'll notice that Minky sheds a lot and it gets all over the place. So my darker fur has already been linty all over this one, so I like to have my lint roller handy. So I'm going to place my pattern pieces on my fabric, and I want the arrow that marks the center of my pattern to be going the same direction as the arrow on my Minky. And I'm going to use this tan fabric for the body and the bottom of the body, as well as for the base. I'm going to wait for just a little bit on the tail. If you like, you can cut out two pieces like this for the tail. I like to do the tail just a little bit different. Since I'm using Minky, cutting it out this tiny, the edges kind of roll, and it's a little bit of a challenge. So I'll show you how I do this little piece a little bit later. But if you'd like to, if you're using flannel or felt or something that doesn't curl up on you, cutting out two of these now is just fine. So I'm going to trace my pieces. I like to use a Sharpie because the lines are thin and really easy to see, but you do want to be careful to make sure it doesn't bleed onto the front of the fabric. You can also use a different marking tool if you prefer. I'm also on the body base going to mark the center as well as where these two little arrows are. And I'm going to mark those just about 1/8 of an inch down on the top of my piece, and that's going to help me line things up later. And now I'll cut them out, and I'll come back after that's done. I have the body pieces cut out, and next I'll show you how I construct the tail and ears. I have 2 small rectangles of Minky here that I'm going to use for the tail. On my pieces of Minky, I have written the direction of the pile on the back, and I'm going to lay them on top of each other so that the direction's going the same way. And then I'm going to place the tail piece on top of it. Rather than cutting the tail piece out along the edges, what I'm going to do is trace the stitch line. So I'm going to trim my pattern piece to the dotted line, which represents where you sew. And I'm going to line this piece with the top edge of my rectangles. I'm going to center it. And I'm going to trace around the edges. And I'm going to pin my fabric together out of the path of the seam allowance. And then I'm going to stitch exactly on my line. I find it's a little easier to sew this way, and that way I don't have to worry about the edges of those tiny pieces lining up. So let's head to the sewing machine. Now that it's been stitched, I'm going to go ahead and cut it out around my stitching. I'm going to trim with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're using fabric that does not stretch, such as felt or flannel, and you cut your pieces out regularly, you may want to trim those seam allowances and clip the curves as well. Now that it's sewn and trimmed, I'm going to turn it right side out. So I'm going to use my hemostats. And so I now have the tail, and I'm going to construct the ears the exact same way, except I'm going to do it twice. Next, let's add the ears to the base of the body. Notice on the pattern piece it has these 2 arrows. Those 2 arrows show you where the ears should be placed. You're going to place one ear directly to the right of the arrow and one ear directly to the left of the arrows. They should be about 1 inch apart. Then I'm going to remove my pattern piece and pin them in place. And the ears should line up right with those marks. So you can see where I transferred my markings before, and the edges of the ears should line up right with those marks. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to baste these in place with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now let's connect this to the top of the body. When we're done sewing, we want them to be positioned like this. So we're going to take this curved edge here, and we're going to lay it right side down on top of the base. And you'll notice that they're curving in opposite directions, and that's just fine. This just means that when we pin it together, we're probably going to have to use a bit more pins to make it go the direction we want it to. I like to start by pinning the 2 sides and then pinning in between. As I pin this, I'm going to take care to make sure I don't move the ears out of position. It's now all pinned. When I sew, I like to sew with the triangle portion on the bottom, because you can see how this edge is all ruffly, so this is the one that I need to take care of when I'm sewing. I want to be careful to make sure that I don't get any pleats, so I may need to stop and adjust my fabric as I go. so I'm going to make sure that I stitch slowly. So I'm going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The ears are now attached. You want to make sure that the seam allowance is pointing towards the top. This will help the ears to stay in place. If you'd like to, you can go ahead and base these two seam allowances in the upward position with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. To sew the body together, we're going to take the piece that we've constructed and fold it in half with right sides together. I'm going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I'm going to leave an opening to turn. So right here on the upper portion of the head, I'm going to leave about an inch, inch and a half for me to turn. So again, I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The sides are sewn, and now I'm going to attach the tail. So I'm going to open up this seam allowance so that it's laying nice and flat. And I'm going to take the tail piece and put it down inside. And I want the raw edge of the tail to line up with the raw edge of the body. So the curved edge that's been sewn is going to point down into the gnome. Line it up so it's nice and straight along that seam. And base it in place with about an 1/8 to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, take the body base piece. And if you want to, you can find the direction of the nap, the direction those hairs are going, and have it go from front to back. So the correct direction, the front to the back. So this is the direction of my pile, so I'm going to put this edge on the front. So if you're looking at the inside of your gnome, you want to place the base right side down so that the right sides are touching. Line up those raw edges and pin all the way around. Once I have it all pinned, I like to sew all the way around the base with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to sew with the gnome sitting on the base. So I'm going to sew with the circle on the bottom. And I'm going to stitch slowly so that I can adjust the fabric on the top as needed. And I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim the seam allowance to an 1/8 of an inch. It's probably not necessary, but I'm going to do it just in case. And if you're using a fabric that does not stretch, you may want to clip the curves here. Now let's turn our gnome right side out. I'm ready to stuff my gnome, and I'm going to put 2 tablespoons of poly pellets inside before I fill it with my stuffing. As I stuff, I'm going to take care to make sure that the ears are facing down. And a good way to do this is to make sure that the seam allowance inside continues to point towards the top. So as I put my stuffing in, I'm going to try to make sure that that seam allowance does not get pushed down. I think my little guy here is stuffed pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch it closed. If you need to know how to slip stitch, see the link below in the description. You can either hand stitch the nose in place or hot glue it. I like to place the nose right in the center between the two ears. Make sure it's in the front, not the back. And I like the top of the pom-pom to rest at the seam line. Next, let's get the antler ready. I'm going to take my pipe cleaner and I'm going to bend it about an inch or so from the top, and I'm just going to fold that down. This is going to be the top of the antler. I didn't want any wire poking out at the very top, so that's why I bent it. Now right below that, I'm going to bend it again, and I'm going to fold it to make the second point on the antler, but I want it to be just a bit smaller than the first. I'm going to pinch it at the base of that V and turn the pipe cleaner down to make the bottom of the antler. And you can make it really however long you want it here. You can even hold it up to your plush to see what size you like it. And then when I get to where I want the bottom to be, I'm going to bend it back up towards the top. And I'm going to wrap it around this top section here, where all of those little ends are. And then I'm going to grab my wire snips and trim off the extra. Take care to hide that pointy bit if you can, and shape it until it's in the position you like it. I like to place it so that the top of the antler aligns with about the point of the gnome. And I'm going to center it on the front. To help make sure that it stays, I'm going to put just a little bit of hot glue along the back here. Not much, but just a smidge to help hold it in place. If you don't want to use hot glue, you can always use some thread that matches your pipe cleaner to tack it down just a little bit. And for our last step, we're going to grab our embroidery floss or yarn. I like to cut a piece that I know is going to be too big. I've cut a piece here that's about 12 inches. And I'm going to wrap it around. Check to make sure it's where you like it. I'm going to shape my bow. And then I'll trim it off to the length I want it. And we've finished our gnome. Isn't he cute? Don't forget to check the links below for tutorials for how to make his Christmas friends. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Happy sewing and happy holidays.